Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho.
Coming up, from dodging danger in Saudi Arabia to defying death in the Himalayas, I talk with two authors who are drawn to writing about adventure and the wild, in landscape and in the imagination. They'll also give us their picks for good summer reading next on Dialogue. Stay tuned. Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Marcia Franklin. It's time for our Good Summer Reading Show, and I'm pleased to welcome two authors to talk about their works and recommend some of their favorite books. Kim Barnes is with us. She's a professor of English at the University of Idaho and the author of two memoirs, In the Wilderness, which was a finalist for the 1997 Pulitzer Prize, and Hungry for the World. She's also written two books of fiction, A Country Called Home, and her latest book, In the Kingdom of Men, which chronicles the story of a young woman from Oklahoma who finds herself in Saudi Arabia in the 1960s. It's been called, quote, an immersive and bracing exploration of one woman's search for freedom amid repression. Welcome, Kim, and congratulations on your new book.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
And visiting us from the wilds of Livingston, Montana, we're joined by Tim Cahill. Tim is a founding editor of Outside Magazine, which he and some other writers from Rolling Stone magazine brainstormed in 1976. He went on to write a popular column for Outside on his adventures and misadventures around the world, as well as contribute to National Geographic Explorer, the New York Times, and other well-known publications. He's the author of 10 books, including A Wolverine is Eating My Leg, Jaguars Ripped My Flesh, and Pecked to Death by Ducks. His works also include Hold the Enlightenment, More Travel, Less Bliss, and Lost in My Own Backyard, A Walk in Yellowstone National Park. It's a pleasure to have you here, Tim, and I have to say it's a pleasure to read those book titles out loud. Now, both Tim and Kim, which sounds great, are in Boise to participate in the Idaho Writers and Readers Rendezvous, presented by the Idaho Writers Guild and the Story Initiative at Boise State University. And I'd like to thank the organizers of that event for lending them to us for this conversation. You can find out more about the rendezvous by going to the Dialogue website. First to you, Kim. Okay, Saudi Arabia. Have you ever been there?
I have not.
You have
Only
not been
in
there.
My imagination.
It is hard to get there, I understand. But you did have family who lived there in the 1950s, right?
The early 60s.
Early 60s,
actually.
and that's where the genesis of the story
That's
came
right.
from?
That's right. My aunt and uncle, my father's eldest sibling, my Aunt Colleen, and she married a roughneck out of the oil fields, Wayne Cook, and they worked for Halliburton. And when they started developing the oil fields, when the Arabian American Oil Company, Aramco, started developing these oil fields in Saudi Arabia, the largest oil fields in the world, they had no one to do the work. They hadn't yet gotten the Bedouins trained to do the work. They were in the process of doing that. But meanwhile, they were recruiting roughnecks from all over the country, all over the world, actually, and my aunt and uncle.
So you heard about this story. I mean, but there's a lot of stories we hear about in our family, but we don't write about them necessarily. What drew you to this story about Saudi Arabia, even knowing that you couldn't go there and do any research?
Right. Well, growing up, my aunt and uncle would come home from Saudi Arabia and bring me these incredibly exotic little gifts, like little Aladdin slippers that still smelled of incense and little camel hide purses with caravans painted on them. And I remembered that vividly, but it wasn't until my aunt and uncle retired and came back to the area in which I live that I started asking them questions. You know, now I knew to ask. And one Thanksgiving I was helping them out to their car with their leftovers and getting them situated. And I asked them if it could ever have happened that an American man would have fallen in love with an Arabian woman. And their response shocked me. They said, "Oh yeah, it happened." And I said, "You're kidding." And I said, "Then what would happen?" And they said, "Oh, they'd hospitalize the man if he was caught and put him under armed guard until they could get him out of the country." So that
what about an American woman falling in love with an Arabian man.
Well, you know, that is that's allowed, but not a Muslim woman with an American man. That wouldn't go well for her, and that became the genesis of this story,
which is about the woman, Virginia Jin, who has some characteristics, I might say, maybe of you. From reading your memoirs?
Yeah, it's Jen is a kind of a mix of my aunt, who went over there from Oklahoma, followed her husband over, and lived in the compounds. For her, it was a great adventure. And the women were divided this way. They either suffered through this time where their husbands were working there, or they turned it into an adventure and just had a ball. That was my aunt. A little bit of my mother, who reminds me, in her kind of, you know, women were always called feisty or spitfires, if they had any kind of will or personality, you know, of their own. And then some of myself as well. Obviously growing up in fundamentalism, as Jen did, but also that inability to obey the patriarchy and all the trials it brought me.
So for viewers watching, encapsulate the story.
Well, the story of In the Kingdom of Men is that Jen McPhee, raised by a Methodist grandfather in Oklahoma, very poverty-stricken, falls in love with a star athlete from her high school who's an idealist, a college-educated boy. And she becomes pregnant, and he drops out of school, and they end up being recruited by Aramco to go to Saudi Arabia. And while there, she basically comes of age and is
pushes authority wherever she can.
And it doesn't go well from there, and
right.
It turns into something of a story of intrigue when her husband disappears.
Well, before we move on to Tim, because I think this is a nice segue, you had to do a lot of research for this because you couldn't go to Saudi Arabia. It's difficult to go to that country. And you found it in all manner of pamphlets and brochures. I mean, because Aramco is very alive and well. I mean, there are students.
Now Saudi Aramco.
Saudi Aramco. Students on many campuses who are Aramco students, as they're called, paid by the company to come here. So a lot of research went into this, even though it was a book of fiction.
Oh, it was an amazing amount of research. And I want to say that I could go to Saudi Arabia if I could find a sponsor. And I probably could find a sponsor. But I was speaking with another author whose book takes place in Venice in 1897. And he said, you know, Kim, if I were you, where you're writing this book and it's set in 1967, I wouldn't go there. Because he said, so much has changed. You need to keep your imagination in the Saudi Arabia of 1967. So I spent 5 years working on this book, but I think 4 years of it was in research. Everything from memoirs to novels written by people from all over the world, including Arab authors, and online journals that came out of Aramco Wives and that kind of thing, the writing they did. So it was, like I say in the book, one of my characters says to my main character, this is added up to the education of Mrs. Jin. And I have to tell you, it was my education as well.
Well, it's In the Kingdom of Men by Kim Barnes. And now we move to Tim Cahill. And Tim, just as an aside, you know, one of the inspirations, and she's mentioned in Kim's book, is Freya Stark, the amazing Dame Freya Stark, who was an adventurer through Arabia and also through Iran. And you've tried to follow her footsteps as well in your travel writing.
Anyway.
In Iran, yeah.
Yeah, I did not go. That whole trip took her from Baghdad across the border into Iran. I just did the Iran
Well,
part.
just is a big deal. But, you know, there were these great travel writers of the day in those days. Very few of them women like her, but certainly role models.
Gertrude Bell.
Yes, Gertrude Bell, another one of them. So have you been to Saudi Arabia, by the way?
No, I haven't.
Okay, yeah. You do have, your master's is actually in fiction, but you wrote nonfiction, and yet similar to Kim using a lot of nonfiction technique research for her fiction, you have always incorporated fiction technique in your writing, your nonfiction writing.
I didn't know any better.
Yeah. I mean, with this story, I mean, you're the character, but having a quest, for instance, is important in your travel
correct.
writing. Something has to happen, just as it did in Kim's novel.
That's right. And a quest will get you away from, a lot of people travel and and it's very, very easy to fall into the tourist hotel people that you can talk to in your own language and comfort, but I'm really interested in the culture of other places, and just to go somewhere and find out something. For instance, we can talk about the salt mines in Tuadeni, the salt mines of the Sahara Desert, proverbial salt mines, the salt mines. I had to go to the salt mines. I had to work in a bad job today. Do they still exist? Are they still there? Well, I went to go see, and in fact I found Tuadeni, the salt mines. There's people working in those mines. I mean, they're digging up salt, the bad salt that's all brown. They build their houses out of. And the white salt is in huge blocks, and they put them on the sides of camels, and these huge camel trains going over the sand dunes with the sun glittering off the blocks of salt is something that you'll remember, I guarantee.
You would never run out of ideas. I mean, it seems that I've read your books, and let's put the book covers up of the titles that I read. They're just, I love these titles. But, you know, you chose these titles to almost make fun of the kind of travel writing that existed before you and your colleagues came on the scene with Outside.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, when we were thinking of Outside magazine, we were thinking that we could write articles that were actually literate. Outdoor magazines were either how-to canoeing, how to paddle a canoe 12 times a year, or hunting magazines, which frankly we couldn't do any better than the hunting magazines do. But the outdoor things were the stories, were the province of magazines with titles like Saga or Argosy. That was the top range, and the rest of them were called Adventure for Man, Man's Adventure. They're called the post-war pulps, and they always had titles like A Wolverine is Eating My Leg, or Jaguars ripped my flesh.
How coincidental that those are the titles of your books.
And I thought, okay. Well, the deal was, when I proposed, as we were starting the magazine, that we could do an adventure type of story, my compatriots, whose names were Harriet Fear and Michael Rogers, kind of turned thumbs down on it, because those were subliterate. That was a subliterate genre, encapsulated in Man's Adventure, Man's Testicle, whatever.
But you wanted to do a literate form of...
I thought that, well, if you see a shark while you're diving, you don't necessarily have to pull out a penknife and battle it to death in great gouts of blood. Perhaps you could write about what you felt, and maybe the core of wonder at the middle of that.
I wanted to read a comment that I found from somebody on an article of yours, or an interview that was done with you. It's a woman who said, Tim Cahill's writing inspired me to travel, to get off my butt and get out there and live. At 50, I went solo to a small village in southern Russia as a volunteer for the USAID. Have since done several trips across 11 time zones there. Keep writing. You're needed in this world. You know,
beautiful. I love that.
People were living vicariously, and do, through both fiction and through what you wrote. I know I'm never going to crawl through a cave, as you have many times. But I was extremely moved when you got to 51 miles into a cave that hadn't been explored, and you named a new room. No, I'm never going to do that. I don't want to do it. But I was living it through you. Similarly, when you nearly died in a river in the Himalayas, I was
That was a laugh a minute.
Gasping for air. But it's true, right? People are living vicariously through your experience.
They're living vicariously, but the thing is, I write about it in a truthful manner, and the truthful manner is that I am not always entirely competent. As a matter of fact, I make some mistakes. And I figure that people look at that and they have a great urge to travel, but travel articles are often written by supermen, superwomen. I could never hope to do that. I'm an ordinary guy and something of a doofus. I hope that people like that woman who this comment, hooray for her, by the way, whose comments you read, I hope that other people feel that way. I hope that other people look at what I've written and say, well, you know, if that clown Cahill can do it, I can do it. I like to think I'm giving people back their dreams by falling down a lot.
Well, when I read it, I was thinking, you know, a lot of people might think that you have a death wish. I was thinking you have a life wish.
Oh, yes.
And that is to see as much as you can while you can. And we were talking about that beforehand with you as well. Let's go to some of your book picks, because I think that this affords a nice opportunity to talk about some people who actually did do that, who were, I don't know if I call them doofuses, but the first book that you're recommending is Wild by Cheryl Strayed. And this is getting a lot of press right now. She walked the entire Pacific Crest Trail when she was 27, had never picked up a backpack before.
No. And as someone who has backpacked, I know I cringed when I realized that. But this is an amazing story about a young woman who is completely lost in her own life, has lost her father, abandoned the family early on, and her mother has just died of sudden onset of cancer. And she just naively decides she's going to walk this trail solo. And it's an amazing story. It's a quest story. It really is, as well as a kind of coming-of-age story, written beautifully.
And Tim, similarly, you would like to recommend A Walk in the Woods by the great Bill Bryson, who after 20 years in Britain came back, and I don't know how much hiking experience he had either. Walked the whole.
He is an avid walker. He walks a lot.
Entire Appalachian Trail.
He did not walk the entire Appalachian Trail. I love Bryson because he starts walking. He walks for about 10 days, and he says, "This is going to take a really long time," and bails out on it.
I thought he had walked a couple.
He walked several sections.
Yeah.
Of it, you know, but I think he only walked in total about 2 weeks.
Really? Okay.
And you see, if it was me, and I said I was going to walk the trail, I would walk the whole dang trail. It doesn't matter because Bill Bryson's book is so funny.
He talks about the people he met on the trail.
And you will laugh aloud, but you will learn a lot about the Appalachian Trail and about the flora and fauna along the Appalachian Trail, and it'll be absolutely painless.
Total change of pace. Kim, you would like to recommend a book that has been around for a while, A Rumor of War by Philip Caputo.
That's right. As I was doing my research, I had to, the new novel is set during the Vietnam War. It just happens that my characters are in Saudi Arabia. And so it made me go back and start looking at the literature of Vietnam, and I had forgotten how incredible that memoir is. It is the classic memoir.
And he won a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting as well for the Chicago Tribune. Another very discomforting experience was Jonestown, which you've written about. You flew in or helicoptered into Guyana, 9 days or a week?
No,
after,
I was there a day or two after it happened, but to actually get to the Jonestown site
took a while.
It took a while, and they. Yeah,
and this is 1,000 Lives, I'm sorry, which is about the Jonestown Massacre.
This is 1,000 Lives, and it's by Julia Shears. And what is amazing about this book is you would think that such a book would be an incredible downer, bummer, and full of disgusting details. She takes you gently by the hand, and she leads you in with the stories of the people whose intentions were nothing but good, and it very gently leads you into it, and by the time things begin to get disturbing, you can't quit. It's a wonderfully, wonderfully done book, and it's done from, now I reported on Jonestown, and I think I got most of it right, but Jones had all of his sermons, all of his talks to the people, which were interminable. They were the Fidel Castro length talks. He had them all taped, and Julia was able to obtain the FBI copies of those tapes,
and classified now.
so she was able to reconstruct the things. And I was really happy to see that my article about the final moments of Jonestown and the quotes that I got from people were almost exactly the very quotes that came off of those tapes. And I said,
You know, one of the survivors ended up in Boise, Idaho.
Yeah.
Carter, I think. Is that his name?
Tim Carter?
Tim Carter, yeah.
Okay.
Ended up here. Another very, very bizarre situation is North Korea. This book is getting rave reviews. It's called The Orphan Master's Son. The author, it's fiction, but the author actually got into North Korea to do some research.
It's an amazing book, and it should be getting all these rave reviews because it's complex, it's a story of intrigue, it's political, it's also a love story, and it's amazing. Talk about cultures and trying to get inside a culture. This book takes you there in spades.
Now, we're kind of on a little bit of a depressing theme here, but these sometimes books are dark that are good, and Blood Meridian is one of those books. I mean, you've called it the Moby Dick of the 20th century.
I believe it is. I believe it is. It's the only book that in recent memory, and perhaps that ever in my life, that after I turned the last page, I opened it up and began it from the front page again. And your viewers should be warned that it is an incredibly brutal book. But the language will drive you through the book.
It's about a gang of people, scalp hunters on the U.S.-Mexico border. Yeah.
About 1876.
He's an amazing, amazing writer, All the Pretty Horses.
He's the All the Pretty Horses guy. It doesn't end pretty. No Cormac McCarthy book ever does.
Well, Kim Barnes' book doesn't necessarily end pretty either, so that's part of life. And then from Blood Meridian to Blood, Bones, and Butter. Now we can get back into the more lighthearted theme here. This is about cooking.
This is a food memoir by the chef, the woman who started Prune. And I love reading food memoirs for the food, but this one I loved reading for the writing. It's about growing up in an amazing family, and her writing is just stunning. It's as good as any literary memoir I've read, so I recommend it highly.
Great. Well, we have just a few minutes left, but I want to make sure to get to some viewer picks. And from Margaret Fuller, who is a writer in her own right, she writes about trails in Idaho. She recommends, similarly to this book, America's Women, 400 Years of Dolls, Drudges, Helpmates, and Heroines by Gail Collins. She says, next time you pop something in the microwave, think about the colonial women in this book who cooked over a fireplace. So, and I just bumped into her, and she said she bought it in a secondhand bookstore where I think it's fun to do. And then from Moji, she wanted to recommend Inez of My Soul, or Inez of My Soul by Isabel Allende. It's about the history of Chile when it was founded by Spanish warriors, a story of one of the first female conquistadors in the New World, her struggle. You know Isabel Allende.
I've met Isabel many, many times. And,
quite a character.
She is. And I've been to Chile many times, and often their version of the New York Times is called El Mercurio, and she's got an article. She often writes articles for the El Mercurio. And I was happy to say that I was profiled in El Mercurio. I brought it to Isabel and said, see.
And of course, from a political family herself.
Yes.
And on the political theme, from Sarah, she recommends God is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens, and who recently passed. Yes. And she says, I like that he's respectful of the beginnings of religion. He writes beautifully. He's funny. He reads and quotes from religious texts, and so his criticism has more weight. He's not just reflexively rejecting them. I'm learning a lot as I read. He's erudite and funny. Did I mention funny? She says. And I have to say, I really like the humor in your work as well. No matter where you were, you interjected humor into the most dire situations.
Yep.
My goodness,
Sometimes
nearly
you gotta
dying in
laugh.
Death Valley, that one. And you were humorous about it. Another political book from Linda, The Real Romney by Michael Kranish and Scott Hellman. She says, the guy's running for president. People should know a little bit more about him than the TV ads and gossip columns. These are two reporters who put this together. And also from Linda, a recommendation of a book close to home, From Scratch, Inside the Lightning Launch of the College of Western Idaho by Dennis Griffin. She says it's the story of the founding of the College of Western Idaho. Given what's happening in education in Idaho right now, in her view, this is a bright spot. So those are viewer picks, which are wonderful to get. And I'd like to, as we start wrapping up, a few more of your picks. Jubilee Hitchhiker by William Yortzberg. Thank you,
William
a neighbor
Yortzberg.
of yours.
His nickname is Gats, so it's pretty easy.
About Richard Brodigan.
It's about Richard Brodigan. It's about the life of Richard Brodigan, I think Gats is trying to reestablish him as a major poet of the 20th century, and perhaps he is. This is a large book. It's almost 900 pages of Richard, and I caution readers once again. The first chapter may be hard to get through. A man who committed suicide. A writer's got a quandary. Do you start with the suicide, or do you end with He starts with the suicide, but there's just wonderful, wonderful Richard stories all the way through it.
I want to make sure we get in The Mountains and the Fathers, Growing Up on the Big Dry by Joe Wilkins. It takes place in Montana, where you live.
That's
A
right.
quick word about why you like this book.
Well, Joe Wilkins was one of my students, and I recognized right away he was going to be an amazing writer. He writes across the genres. And this memoir is incredibly lyrical. It's a kind of looking back at his father he lost when Joe himself was a boy, and what his inheritance is in this Montana landscape.
And we have just under a minute left. What's next for you, Kim?
Oh, I'm trying to decide between memoir and novel, but I witnessed an amazing scene this summer while I was fly fishing of a young father carrying his two young sons across a swollen river, and with a chainsaw in one hand and his white logging boots around his neck, and walking off into the wilderness. And I have not been, it was a mythic moment. And so I'm hoping that will lead me into a new story.
Nice. And for you, you're going to Africa, yes?
I'll be hiking just south of Lake Turkana through Samburu country, and it's one of those adventure for a cause things. It's almost like a walkathon, except that we're going across a desert that local people tell us, "Oh, you'll die." But I've done this. I know how to do this.
And it's a walkathon to help AIDS orphans.
To help AIDS orphans, especially in central Kenya, which has been hit very hard.
Well, will we see that in writing?
I believe I'm going to write about it for AARP.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Well, wonderful. Stay safe.
I will.
Thanks for tuning in to this edition of Dialogue. You've been listening to Kim Barnes and Tim Cahill, two writers, talking about their works and their picks for good summer reading. I'm Marcia Franklin.
Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho. Check out our website, become a friend on Facebook, or follow us on Twitter.